We are back at The Source. My name is Mike Balsom, and joining us in studio today, Debbie Zimmerman. And no, it's not an election. She's here to talk about the wine industry, as we promised off the top. Debbie, representing the Grape Growers of Ontario, welcome to the program.
Well, nice to see you again, even though I kind of hoping maybe we'll get an election. Missed that.
We're talking wine today, some challenging times, COVID-19 and some other factors. How are the local wineries and wineries across the province faring?
Well, I think the challenge has been the wineries were shuttered from March 13 onward. They're now open, but limitations on tastings, and they're doing much better in the sense that people are looking for a place to go in Ontario, so they're choosing the wine regions, which is great. So they're busy, but you know that time, if you didn't have a presence online and you couldn't buy wine online, and I want to thank consumers who are buying Ontario wine. It's really important. It's been tough, and thrown into that is this World Trade Challenge from Australia. We lost out of the 4 measures, we've lost 2 of them. We were able to retain 2, but even those are not as good as we would like. The negotiations were tough. The harvest is going well. It's a smaller crop, and certainly it'll be good vintage this year, a very good vintage.
Did some of the smaller wineries take advantage of government incentives to move their business online?
There are, but those came after. I mean, those are things that were announced after, when they realized if you hadn't, there was some money available, but it's not enough to move the needle for some small wineries. Small wineries really make their money in a direct sale to a consumer. Going through the LCBO, they're treated like an import. So they pay all this additional tax. That if you have that sale right through the cellar door, it's always a better sale for small wineries.
I imagine that for all of our local wineries here in Niagara, that summer season is the biggest time, and
Absolutely.
what they count on to make a profit, if they're making a profit each and every year.
Yeah.
We've lost that this season, so will it ever be made up for?
So what can we do as an industry collectively to make sure the government understands the importance of a domestic industry? It's a challenge for growers right now. We have grapes that don't have a home. And this is, ironically, Agricultural Week. And every grape should find its way into a bottle of wine in Ontario. But sadly, we're competing with bulk wine that comes into this province, goes into a bottle of wine, calls itself International Domestic Blend, and that's 25% Ontario, 75% imported. And unfortunately for us, we can't compete with those grapes coming in from another country, and nor should we in a domestic market. So if anything, this pandemic has opened up, I think, a lot of people to the importance of local.
Why is that allowed, that 75% volume can be from other countries?
It was put in place when the Ontario wine industry was just growing. It was newly formed after the last free
So it was almost a way to prop it up in its early days.
In its early days, it was supposed to sunset in the year 2000. For whatever reason, it's carried on as called the Wine Content and Labeling Act. It's time to change.
And some of the bigger wineries are able to take advantage of that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a product that you'll see in a bag in a box. I always ask people to make sure you understand what you're drinking and to read labels, because that's important going for the domestic industry. We've matured and grown up. It's now time to take a second look at why we need a content that preserves 75% of grapes from other countries and only allows 25% of our domestic grapes in a bottle.
You mentioned this year's harvest and how some of those grapes will be left to rot. And is that because the volume that wasn't sold now will have to be sold in the future? And there's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not they're going to be able to sell what gets bottled this year?
These wineries can shop the world for surplus. And so what's happening is they're shopping the world for these cheaper grapes of the same variety we're growing in Ontario. And that's the challenge for us, because we're now being asked to compete with very cheap grapes coming in from Argentina and Chile, even Australia. And that's the challenge for us. We are in a different environment in Ontario. Our supports are different, our business practices are different, and we can't compete with these cheap products. And then they get a tax benefit on top of that, and they're allowed to sell out of a private retail system that they control, 5 players, and basically comes down to 3. So it's a competitive advantage our VQA 100% Canadian wineries don't have. we're asking the government of Ontario specifically to renew or to review the retailing model that currently exists in this province and put the benefit where it should be on domestic.
Debbie, why are the lobbying efforts not as successful with the wine industry as they might be in the dairy industry and some other agricultural industries that are able to sort of force their way or get their way, convince different levels of government to help them out?
It's a really good question. We're not supply managed, and chicken and dairy are. So they're supply managed and they're Canadian wide. So supply management has got the 100% support of the Canadian government and has been defended. We have the same benefit right now from the federal government in the form of a federal excise tax program that was put in by the Honourable Jim Flaherty back in 2006. That is the one program that the Australians challenged and won. So that has to be repealed in the year 2022. So we're asking the Government of Canada to replace that program some other way, some other benefit that is the same benefit that we're currently getting through a federal excise tax relief in another program that only supports 100% Canadian. We don't want it watered down to support 25% domestic and 75% imported. We want it to be for 100% Canadian, and we're going to fight for that. So our efforts right now are saying to the federal government, your commitment to Canadian agriculture is there. We want to make sure your commitment to the Canadian grape and wine industry is going to be there. Ontario's laws are antiquated when it comes to the domestic industry. As I said, we're treated like an import when we come into the LCBO. So we're taxed the same way as an import product. And we're saying we don't want to be taxed like that. We want to be taxed as a domestic. Most other wine regions in the world, you'll never find the kind of tax treatment we get in our market. They're treated as a domestic product. You go to anywhere in Europe, find very hard to find either any other product but the one that's grown in that particular country.
Right. Efforts will continue to try and get this changed.
Yes.
Do you have a timeline in mind?
Well, for the federal excise, we have got to get that done within the next year and a half. I mean, that is critical for us because it expires in 2022. And a lot of the wineries that came post 2006 have known nothing but a federal excise tax exemption, which is part of their business strategy. So this is critical to this industry in Niagara. And we are the most value add of any ag product in Ontario.
Debbie, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
We'll be back with more on The Source.